This video is designed to introduce you to Punnett square problems. I know we've been talking a lot about vocabulary so far, but there are two more terms that we have to cover before we can finally get into doing some Punnett square problems. I'm going to go back to this diagram from the other video to kind of set the stage for this a little bit. For example, if we look at the different seed shapes that are available in plants, it's either round or wrinkled. If you remember from before, the dominant trait here is round. The way we know that is if you mix a round plant with a wrinkled plant, you get all round offspring, which shows that round is dominant. There's one of two ways to represent round then. If you remember from the previous video, the letter that we're going to use to represent the alleles in this case is going to be the first letter of the dominant trait. So for example, if something is round, if a pea plant has round peas, it either has two dominant alleles. Remember, these alleles come from the parents. So this one would get one dominant allele from one parent, the other dominant allele from the other. Or the other option is it has one dominant allele and one recessive allele. In this case, the dominant allele takes over. So this plant got one dominant trait from one parent, the recessive trait from the other, but the dominant trait takes over, and so this pea plant is still round. The only way to get wrinkled is to get two recessive alleles. So we'd have to get the recessive trait from both parents. In that case, it ends up being wrinkled. Keep in mind, we're using the first letter of the dominant trait. So lowercase r's are used to represent wrinkled instead of w's. This is going to be very important when we get to more complicated Punnett square problems, because eventually we'll be using more than one letter in the problem. And if you're using r's and w's here, it's going to make things very, very confusing once we get to those. So always remember, the letter that's selected is the first letter of the dominant trait. It's extremely important. The reason we're going over this is, let's say you have an individual that is capital R. We'll even go with this guy here. We'll go with capital R, lowercase r instead. We'll say this is the individual we're trying to describe. There's two ways to describe that individual. One thing has to do with its phenotype. What I want you to think of with phenotype is associate this with physical. So it's how this one physically looks. This guy, capital R, lowercase r over here, this is the heterozygous individual. This one physically looks like it has round seeds. The next term is its genotype. The genotype here is heterozygous. Or you could just represent it as capital R, lowercase r, because this one has one trait from a dominant trait from one parent and a recessive trait from the other. The reason this is important is things can have one phenotype but a different genotype. For example, if we're looking at this individual, the phenotype here is still round because it has two capitals, so those capitals represent that it has two dominant traits, so it will have round peas, but since it's two capital R's, this one is no longer heterozygous. This one would be homozygous dominant, or capital R, capital R. So the phenotype and genotype are the two sort of vocab terms here. The trick to remembering genotype, which I forgot to mention, associate this with genes. So just in a general sense, phenotype is what it physically looks like. Genotype are the genes of the individual. Now we're finally going to apply some of this knowledge that you've been using with all the different vocabulary terms you've acquired. I'm going to walk you through how to answer one of the simple Punnett square problems. So this is our problem that we start with. It's a very simple one, and I'm giving you a lot of support with this. Eventually, I'll give you less support when it comes to the problems, but the first step with all of these is just to go through and read it. It says, in garden peas, round seed coats, which here I tell you to represent that with a capital R. That information won't always be in the problem, but for these simpler ones, it's in there. So in garden peas, round seed coats, capital R, is dominant over wrinkled seed coats, lowercase r. Again, remember, we're going with the first letter of the dominant trait. So even though it's wrinkled, we're still using a lowercase since that's recessive. What will the results be of a cross between a homozygous dominant plant and a homozygous recessive plant? Now, there's a system for going through and answering these problems, which I'll lay out for you in the very last part of this video. But the first thing I always suggest you do is figure out what's dominant and what's recessive. So if we look back at our problem, you'll see that round seed coats are dominant. So we're going to write that in under our dominant trait. The dominant trait here is round. The recessive trait then is wrinkled. The next thing that I suggest you do is to figure out the parents. So if we're looking at the problem again, it says a homozygous dominant plant. So homozygous, if you remember from before, prefix homo tells us it's the same. If it's the same and they're dominant, that means it has two dominant traits. Since the dominant trait here is round, we know that we'll be using a capital R. So our first parent, which you're going to write the parents in this box, is capital R, capital R. Again, the way we figured that out, prefix homo tells us it's the same, dominant tells us they're going to be capital letters. So if we look at the next one, it says a homozygous recessive plant for the second parent. Again, homo tells us same, recessive though tells us something different. Recessive tells us we're going to use the recessive trait. Now it's not a W for wrinkled. Remember, I cued you into this in the problem up above. It's a lowercase r. So our second parent is just going to be lowercase r, lowercase r. The next step is kind of simple. You take these traits and you put them in the Punnett square. I'm going to shift this over just a little bit to buy myself some room. But if we're putting these traits in our Punnett square, I always take the first parent and put them on the top of the Punnett square, the second parent and put them along the side. Truthfully, it doesn't really matter, but I think as long as you're doing these problems, try to do them the same way every time. It makes things easier. So again, we're taking the first parent, putting it on top of the Punnett square. So we've got capital R, and then on the other side, we've got lowercase r, lowercase r. At this point, it's just like those little multiplication tables you used to use as a little kid. You figure out where things intersect. So capital R and lowercase r intersect in this box, so we'll put both of them in there. Please keep in mind, you always want to write the capital letter first. For this problem, since it's a simpler one, they actually all end up the same way. They're all capital R, lowercase r. So the next step in the problem is to figure out the offspring genotype. The genotype, if you remember, is going to be what their genes actually are. So if we're looking back at our Punnett square over here, this one's kind of simple because they're all the same. They won't always be this way. You'll eventually end up getting different results in some of the different boxes. But in this case, all of our genotypes are the same. They're all capital R, lowercase r. The last thing to do then is figure out the offspring phenotype. Remember, we're associating phenotype with physical. So you've got to look back at this guy and say, well, what does this one look like? Since it's a capital R, that stands for round, which is the dominant trait. So that's going to overpower the recessive trait of wrinkled that it has in the second one. So this one is going to be round. It's going to have round seeds. And that's it. You've now completed the Punnett square. Again, this was a very simple example. And keep in mind, I'm telling you things in here that I won't always give you as examples in the problem. For example, I told you what letters to use. That will not always be there. I underlined the parents. That will not always be done either. So this problem was a simple one to get things started. As we work our way through the chapter, they're going to become a little bit more challenging. In the final section of this video, I'm just going to give you the steps to going through and answering the Punnett square problems. Honestly, if you do the steps the same way every time, it makes answering these things very, very easy. It gets you into a routine, and it gives you, like a set step-by-step approach on what to do next. So again, the final thing is just the steps. The very first step is you have to figure out what is dominant and what's recessive. That information is going to come from the problem. Sometimes you might have to read into it a little more than others. I pretty much came right out and told you in the last problem. That won't always be the case as things get a little bit more complicated. The next thing is to figure out the parent genotypes. So what are the genes of the parents? On the last one, we had one that was homozygous dominant. The other one was homozygous recessive. So one was capital R, the other one was lowercase r, lowercase r. The next thing you have to do is just fill in your Punnett square. Remember, you're filling that in with your parent genotypes. The next thing you have to do is figure out the offspring genotype. So these are the letters or the alleles that represent the offspring. And then the final thing is the offspring phenotype. This is going to be what that genotype represents. So in the last problem, the offspring phenotype was capital R, lowercase r, and you had to figure out what that looks like. So in this case, that's going to be a round plant for us. So if you follow these 5 simple steps, you'll be able to approach and answer pretty much any of the problems that you come across, at least in the first part of the chapter. Things are going to get a little bit more complex at the end, but this is a very, very good, just step-by-step approach to answering these problems. So I know this video got a little long, but I really think that this is something that requires a bit more explanation early on, and later when you start working through the problems on your own, it becomes much simpler. But if you follow these steps, I promise you, it'll make things much easier for you in the end. As always, I appreciate you watching, and make sure you answer the questions at the end of the video.